they were found is really cool, because they were found by a boy throwing rocks into a cave. He's throwing rocks. I can imagine Cody throwing rocks in the cave, and he heard a crack, and he went and looked in, and there was these clay pots. They stood about this tall, and they were big round clay pots. And I used to have the model of one. I actually gave it to Daryl, our old minister, and but it was just they were the top of them had kept them preserved, and he went and told his father or whoever, and they came back and they saw these clay pots, and that was cave 1. Now there's been multiple caves with multiple scrolls that have been found. Some of them are scripture, some of them are commentaries, like the Habakkuk commentary and stuff, which is cool to be able to read someone else from 1,000 years ago, even before Christ, how they're commenting on what Habakkuk said, and the Genesis Apocryphon, which speaks about things that the Genesis doesn't tell us about, but just things that were commented about, like the beauty of Sarah and things like that was never really elaborated on in Scripture. We know she was beautiful. Why? Because every time Abraham went somewhere, he was worried someone's going to steal him from her. but the book really, it engages these subjects. And so there's a ton of literature. And where that literature came from, it is believed, it has never been actually proven, was from a group called the Essenes. The Essenes was a very aesthetic community. They were very separated. They were, I say aesthetic, I use the wrong word there, but they were a very separate community. They believed that the Jewish people had gone into apostasy, and they had separated from them, effectively becoming the people. They felt like they were in the wilderness. They just felt like the Jews were too worldly, and they were going to come out and be away from them.
They were the Amish back then.
Basically, yes. And they believed very much that that they were right by separating. And what's funny is it has been conjectured, and I disagree wholeheartedly, but it has been conjectured that John the Baptist was an Essene. Why? Because he's separated and he was out in the wilderness and stuff like that. I don't agree with that, but that's part of the argument is that he had been influenced by the Essene community. Either way, this is a picture of the Psalms from, and I'll pass this around because I know you probably can't see very well. This is a picture of what the Psalm scroll, portion of the Psalm scroll would look like from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is the place where the Essenes, this was their scriptorium. This is where they would have gone. You'll notice, I believe it's right here, there's a place where they would have gone and bathed before writing. They would have basically been baptized every morning before they went to write scripture. It was part of their tradition.
Is it true they also did it before they would write the name of God?
I've heard that before. I can't say yes or no because I don't know. But I've read that before. I will say this: they would replace the name of God with other names to not write the Tetragrammaton.
Yeah.
To not write the sacred name.
Yeah, I heard.
Which is why we get words like Adonai and things like that. In fact, it's argued that the word Jehovah is a cross combination between Yahweh and Adonai. If you look at the words put together, it would make a Jehovah sounding name. All right, but I'll pass this around, give you guys a chance to look at that. All right, so that is the actual Hebrew witnesses to the Old Testament. Now, there are other Old Testament witnesses as well. There is the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is a manuscript of the Hebrew text, covers the first 5 books of Moses. That goes to around 400 BC. We have the Septuagint, which is what we've already talked about. The Septuagint, or the Septuagint, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it was translated about 250 BC. So we go back there again. We're going way back to almost the time when some of these books were written. We have a few other things like the Latin Vulgate, the Aramaic Targums, the Syriac Peshitta. But one other place that's really important that we have testimony to the Old Testament is what is called the Talmud. And I've already mentioned what that is. The Talmud was the teachings of the rabbis. Well, anytime you teach the Bible, you quote the Bible. If you read my sermons, if you went and picked out all my sermons, you would see that I have quotations of the Bible throughout my lessons. Well, that's a place where we can actually see quotations of the Bible, some of the quotations dating back to any of the early manuscripts that we have. So it's just one more testimony that what we have in our Bible is the same as what they had in their Bible, because we see what they were teaching from. Thus, it's confirming to us what we've been taught. Okay? So that's, again, I don't mean to be going quickly, but this is just basically historical information. Number 4, and last for the Old Testament. the reasons why we can trust the Old Testament. Number one, the meticulous care of the Jewish scribes. There are 6 things that Jewish scribes would do. This is going back to what you were talking about. Number one, the copyist was required to sit in full Jewish dress after complete bathing. That was part of the, now how that made his copying any better, not necessarily sure, but it did ensure that he understood the importance of what he was doing. He had to bathe and put his clothing on before he sat down. This is much different than the New Testament, by the way. We're going to get there in a minute. The New Testament was not copied by people in full dress. They didn't have scriptoriums. They didn't have these things. You're looking at a fully vested community of faithful people within the Jewish community. They had temples. They had priests. They had clothing. They had everything. When the early church started, all we had was bread and wine. And looking for a river to have a baptism. We didn't have any of this stuff. So the way the New Testament is copied over, much different than this. But I'm just saying, this is Old Testament, and that's what we're dealing with right now. The Hebrew community was very meticulous. They dressed a certain way. Only a certain kind of ink could be used, very special type of ink. Rules were used for governing the spacing of words. Not only were the words important, but the spacing between the words. There was rules for that.
I thought they didn't have spaces.
No, that's Greek. No word or letter could be written from memory. Everything had to be copied like that. You couldn't just remember what the next letter was. You had to copy. You want to talk about the time, taking time to do that.
I guess a Xerox salesman could make good money back then.
Oh, yeah. Lines and letters were methodically counted. We already talked about that. They'd count, and there was a way to know what letter was supposed to be in the middle of the page. And then, of course, number 6, if a manuscript was found to have even one error, it was destroyed. Now, that is great, except that means we don't have very many Old Testament manuscripts. Because if they found an error, they destroy it. When you look at the manuscript tradition for the Old Testament, we have very few. You look at the manuscript tradition for the New Testament, we have a bazillion. We got over 5,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts, but guess what? A lot of them have little errors in them because they didn't destroy one just because it had an error in it. That's why there's what you call textual criticism within the New Testament, where you deal with these, where certain copies say one word, certain copies say another word. That's why that's there. You don't have that type of textual criticism. It's still there in the Old Testament, but much less, because you have less manuscripts to work with, and the less manuscripts you have to work with, the less variants you're going to have. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. If every one of you, if I asked you to copy the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, if every one of you copied it, well, I'd have a lot of variants to work with. If I had 3 of you copy it, I wouldn't have as many variants to work with. That's just the way it works. All right, so that's the first reason why we can trust the Old Testament, is because of the meticulous care of the Jewish scribes. The second reason is the work of the Masoretes. The Masoretes, again, I mentioned this earlier, their whole undertaking was for the purpose of giving the Scripture preservation. That was their whole undertaking. From the years 500 to 1000, they came together to preserve this text. And it was like, that was just, and again, they added the vowel sounds and all that, but there were so many copies that came out of the Masoretic period. There's a Masoretic tradition within the Jewish community, and that's where this came from. So that's another reason they had a tremendously important work in history. And then finally, of course, the confirmation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, wonderful confirmation that what we have is actually what God has given to us. So that's 3 major reasons why we can trust the Old Testament. Now, on to the New. Get a breath, and we'll go. All right, New Testament, whole different story. Absolutely start to finish, 100% different story. But here's what, the first thing, even before we get to your notes, here's the great thing about the New Testament. The Old Testament was written over a 1,000-year period of time. It was written from 1450 approximately to 400 approximately. So you're looking at a 1,000-year period of time. That means the guy who wrote that had no idea who that guy was. I mean, they never met. Okay? Because they couldn't 1,000 years later. Not like it was before the flood where everybody lived 1,000 years. You know, it didn't work that way. But in the New Testament, it's written over literally a 50-year period. I mean, much different story. And depending on how you how you date Revelation, that could even be shortened a lot. Because there are people who date Revelation before 70. If you date Revelation, the last book written, before 70, you're going to get down to like 30-year period. But when I say 50, I'm looking at a date of around 95, and I see Richard smiling at me because I know he's a late dater. We talked about that before, but that's fine. There is discussion within the community.